So also from my side, a very warm welcome to all participants. Glad to see all these people here. So, and we'll just start. Just before starting, just for the completeness, this presentation is based on my best knowledge, of course, and of my understanding of the requirements that are now in line for the medical devices in Europe. Very shortly about me. I am first-time mathematician, but also I am in the medical device sector now since more than 20 years, or almost 20 years, mostly as medical writer for clinical evaluation reports, PMS, PMCF for medical devices, where I have already now evaluated more than 150 devices. My main indications are cardiology. I've done a lot also in ECMO and in osteosynthesis. I'm also startup judge for a big innovator. I am on the advisory board for some startups. And I'm also investing myself in startups that are promising and interesting for me. Very shortly about me. Today, I want to first...
Before you go forward, where are you calling in from? Where do you live and work out of?
I live in Germany, just in the middle of Germany. I have to say big cities, I suppose, Paul. Maybe you know Cologne, you know Frankfurt am Main. And when you just put a little line between these two cities, just in the middle there.
So you're there now?
What?
You're there now. You're working there.
Yeah. I am in Germany now, yes.
Okay, fantastic. Just curious. Good.
Thank you. Of course. Yeah. So I first want to do the groundings today here. I want to show you what are the biggest pitfalls in CEP, CEAR writing. How can we avoid them? What are the top non-conformities for the notified body responses before we go to the different pathways that lead to CE marking, wet devices, legacy devices, Article 61, orphan devices, CMD devices. We will go through this later in detail. And for all these, what is sufficient clinical data? If we have a little bit time, then I don't know yet how it's going. And if there are a lot of questions in between, I don't know. Then we will have a short look at the new MDCG 2025-6 for clinical evaluation of MDAIs, which was just released last week. So first of all, what's the aim of a clinical evaluation? We have to prove the compliance with the relevant GSPRs in accordance with Annex 1 of the MDR. We have to assess adverse effects. We have the assessment of the benefits with risk ratio. And very important, we have to verify the medical or clinical claims of the manufacturer. Before we can write a clinical evaluation report, we have to plan this report and what are the requirements and what are the contents of the CEP. We have to determine the relevant GSPRs. We have to set the intended purpose of the product, including indications and contraindications. We have to describe the clinical benefit, the product specifications and instructions for use. We have to include the risk management results already, preclinical studies, for example, biocompatibility. We have to include a clinical development plan for this special product and our data from PMS and PMCF. So Victoria already has a question, I saw.
No, Sean had put a comment about anyone who wants to be promoted to panelist, but not yet. Thanks.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, and first, for the CEP, what we have to do first is that we have to determine our relevant GSPRs, requiring clinical data that are not, or a pitfall for these GSPRs is that these GSPRs require clinical data, and this data is not identified or incomplete and or do not align with those identified in other parts of the technical documentation. For example, the sufficient accuracy, precision, and stability of a device with a measuring function is supported by clinical evidence from a clinical study, but we don't mention the GSPR 15.1 in the CEP. So manufacturer always has to ensure that all references to the GSPRs, which require supporting clinical data, are aligned across the whole technical documentation. In practical, according to the MDR article 61.1, we need at least the GSPRs 1 and 8. There are still exceptions where we don't need them after article 61.10, but in practice, we can always recommend also to use the GSPRs 5 and 6, meaning mistakes by user. For example, if you have risky products that are used by non-professionals, like blood sugar measuring, and GSPR 6 is safety and performance throughout the whole lifetime. For example, if you have implants in the body of a patient that are not intended to be taken away after some time, then this lifetime still has to be the same as the remaining lifetime of the product. If you maybe will submit a technical documentation to BSI, I can only recommend that you put the GSPRs 5 and 6 inside them, otherwise it will be refused.
Can you make your slides a little bigger? Is that possible? Is it possible to maximize them?
How can you do this now?
Oh, sorry.
No, sorry. I have no idea how to do this. In my screen, because I'm just using different screens, it is as big as possible here.
Okay, well, maybe you can make the slides available afterwards.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no problem with this. So the second pitfall is that the intended purpose is vague or is incomplete, and the documentation does not clearly differentiate between the intended purpose and the indications. As we need a clear, unambiguous, and specific intended purpose, which fulfills the Article 212 of MDR. Intended purpose is critical for determining that the device is a medical device and further the device's risk classification and clinical data requirements. It is subject to scrutiny by the notified body and will be challenged if vague or incomplete. So our clinical evaluation plan should clearly differentiate between the indications and the intended purpose. But in the absence of an MDR definition, manufacturers are directed to the MDCG 2026, where the indications are defined as the clinical condition that is to be diagnosed, prevented, monitored, treated, alleviated, compensated for, replaced, modified, or controlled by the medical device. And this should be distinguished from the intended purpose or intended use, which should describe the effect of the device. Lack of consistency in the intended purpose and indications for use across the device's technical documentation is our next pitfall, which is very often named by the notified body. So manufacturers are advised to cross-check the intended purpose statement and the indications for use throughout the whole technical documentation. The clinical benefit, so this is the role of the device in improving the health of the patient or patient management or public health, is not clearly described. Accurately defining the clinical benefit is an important starting point in the clinical evaluation process, as the MDR requires the manufacturer to demonstrate that the benefits associated with use of the device outweigh the potential risks to patient safety. When defining these clinical benefits, the manufacturer should consider the role of the device in diagnosis, monitoring, prevention, treatment, alleviation, etc. of a device, injury, or disability, and the subsequent positive impact. If we have software devices, the role of the software in the overall clinical workflow should be carefully considered, dependent on the clinical performance of the device. The clinical benefit may be direct or indirect. A very, very crucial point is now our acceptance criteria. CEP does not clearly provide an indicative list and specifications of parameters to be used to determine, based on the state of the art in medicine, the acceptability of the benefit-risk ratio for the various indications and for the intended purpose or purposes of the device. So, to determine acceptability of the benefit-to-risk ratio of the device, the performance and safety outcomes, the methods used, for example, objective clinical tests, validated prompt questionnaires, etc., and the acceptance criteria must be defined based on state of the art, including product-specific standards, if possible. What people often forget is the clinical development plan, according to the Annex 14 Part A.
Your call has been forwarded to an automated voice messaging system. 40.
The manufacturer does not provide a clinical development plan for legacy devices. People always think that this plan only has to be submitted or to be included if we have new submissions, but this is not correct. However, considering the regulatory status of legacy devices, this level of detail is not expected, and rather the CDP may focus on the strategy to obtain clinical evidence in line with MDR Article 61 requirements and, of course, the planned PMCS activities. If applicable, CDP should also always include a justification for any deficiencies in relation to previously conducted first-in-man studies, feasibility or pilot studies, confirmatory investigations, noting any reference to PMCF activities that are ongoing or reference to the PMCF plan are described in Annex 14. So now we have the biggest pitfalls for the CEP so that we could go to our beloved clinical evaluation report. And the first pitfall there is the update frequency. The update frequency is not clearly defined per MDR Article 62.11, where it said that the clinical evaluation and its documentation shall be updated throughout the life cycle of the device concerned with clinical data obtained from the implementation of manufacturer's PMCF plan in accordance with Part B of Annex 14 and the post-market surveillance plan referred to in Article 84. So clinical evaluation must be updated throughout the whole life cycle of a device, of course, with clinical data from PMS, PMCF processes, and of course, if we have any major events or ever what happens, recalls or whatever, we have to update this. And as this is not clearly defined in the MDR regulations, the expectation is that manufacturers align the frequency of clinical evaluation updates with the guidance currently available from the MedTech 271 Revision 4. And based on this guidance, the clinical evaluation should be updated minimum when the manufacturer receives PMS, including PMCF information, which has potential to change the current evaluation. It has to be updated at least annually if the device carries significant risks or if it is not well established. Otherwise, it has to be at least updated every 2 to 5 years if the device is not expected to carry significant risks and it's well established. For the Class 3 and implantable devices, an annual update should be considered. Anyway, the manufacturer is expected to justify the defined frequency for performing the updates of the clinical evaluation. Very important part of the evaluation is the defining of the state of the art. State of the art is not clearly defined, is incomplete, and is not clear how the acceptance criteria for safety and performance outcome has been established based on the state of the art. So evaluation of the device within the context of state of the art is essential for demonstrating that when used as intended, the benefits outweigh any potential risk.
So if you're working with a client, Stefan,
yeah,
right, and they come to you and they say, you know, we need to define state of the art, what do you tell them? You know, like let me derail you for a minute.
Yeah, of course. From the starting point to define for the whole analysis, manufacturers must define the state of the art for their device. So this is critical as it facilitates the characterization of the expected clinical performance and the resulting clinical benefit, the clinical safety profile for the device under evaluation. And this is a very good question. I just go one. No, it's too early. It's coming a little bit later, I see there, yeah, because it is very, very crucial when we are defining the state of the art that the literature search for state of the art has to be completely different to the literature search for our clinical data, for our evaluation of our GSPRs. And this is often also not done by the manufacturers, or often forgotten. We have to put this in our literature search plan, clearly defined our searches for state of the art, clearly defined our searches for the clinical data, and they all has to be justified. And this is also one of the biggest pitfalls for the notified bodies, the biggest deviations there, that the state of the art, the literature search for state of the art is not clearly defined and is not justified. Has this answered your question, Sean?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
And
yeah.
If there's time, Lisa also has a question.
Is it possible that we put these questions to the end?
Yeah, that's possible.
We started quite lately, so I would like to go through a little bit because I want, of course, do what is enough sufficient clinical data, but I have to put on the grounds here. It is not so long anymore until we come to the interesting themes. But so if it is also okay for you, Lisa, I would like to put the questions to the end. Okay?
Sure. Thank you.
So this is exactly what we will talk about. This is what is sufficient clinical evidence. This is I will also put this a little bit afterwards because it's a total bigger thing that I will talk about. Just for completeness, this is already mentioned here also. Conclusions regarding acceptability of the benefit to risk ratio do not consider all available data. This is also that sometimes also during my experience, that manufacturers don't want or don't mention if they had adverse effects or negative impacts on patient management or public health. And this is, of course, a big disadvantage. And of course, this will lead to a negative impact. The device lifetime has to be clearly defined in the CEAR. This can be defined in minutes, days, years, months, or whatever, or just like I mentioned before, in case of implants, which are not intended to be removed, the lifetime of the device is equal to the remaining lifetime of the patient. When we start our clinical evaluation, we have to choose our strategy. Strategy chosen for clinical evaluation or the rationale for applicability of the MDR Article 61 requirements are not clearly presented in the clinical evaluation documentation. So MDR Article 61 already describes different options for clinical evidence to support conformity of the device. Level of clinical evidence selected by the manufacturer is dependent on several factors, including the risk classification of the medical device and its regulatory status. So, what people always forget, and what is, in my opinion, very, very, very important, when you look at the FDA clearance, normally all people go in the pre-sub before, and people often think that is not possible in any way when you want to CE mark your product, but this is not true. I only can recommend go in dialogue with your notified body. Most common reasons for delays in technical documentation by notified bodies are incomplete submissions. When you have insufficient or missing information not provided that is required for the conformity assessment activities. This includes an incomplete or inconsistent description of devices covered by the application and the related technical documentation, or variants, accessories, combined devices that are covered by the basic UDI/DI to be assessed. If you have a lack of cohesive structure of technical documentation, information is presented with the technical documentation, but it is difficult to locate. To avoid delays and to further improve your submission, please consider the following practical points. I can only recommend go in communication with a notified body before you start an application. So if you do this, you should contact the notified body to clarify language requirements for technical documentation submission of the individual notified body. This is mentioned in the MDR Article 52.12, I think. Manufacturers should contact the notified body to clarify requirements related to documentation in labeling, methods for submission to the notified body. Additional guidance on topics suitable for the discussion with the notified body prior to the submission are also provided in the MDCG 2019-6. This must be section 163. This is the so-called structured dialogue. So structured dialogue takes place before the official application of an MDR or IVDR application is submitted to the notified body. Dialogue is intended to clarify timing, procedure, regulatory aspects of the application process, and serves to answer questions about application forms, documents to be submitted. Structured dialogue, very important, is completely independent of the conformity assessment, including a discussion with the customer before the customer submits the actual application for conformity assessment. For this reason, and to demonstrate independence, neutrality, and objectivity, the structured dialogue service offered by a notified body is commissioned separately from the MDR or IVDR framework agreement. So what can we ask? Possible topics and questions for the structured dialogue are application and onboarding, the onboarding process, application forms, application review processes, the location, suppliers, products, product classification, the code assignment. You can ask about testing, certification regulations, MDR or IVDR framework agreements, dealing with the medical device, possible changes, and if you want to change to another notified body. The product planning deadlines for special procedures, obligations to submit costs, fees, other economic aspects, common specification guidelines, and harmonized standards that we have to use in our assessment procedure. So I can only recommend to use these things so that you will have a much, much smoother application. We'll have now a look at the top 5 non-conformities which are taken out of the reviews of notified bodies. So this is the practical part. Yeah, what is most that notified bodies do not accept. This is top 1, safety and performance parameters and the threshold values, equivalence of other devices, PMCF activities, the literature search, just as mentioned before, and the clinical claims. Safety, performance parameters, and threshold values are not determined or insufficient, or the acceptance criteria or the values are not defined. What's often happening is that in the state-of-the-art research, you see a visible outlier, and the manufacturer takes this as a threshold value, and this will not be accepted by notified bodies. Equivalence, just for all the people who are joining this call here from the States, has a different view to the equivalence of the FDA. Yeah, so here equivalence is required in all points, meaning clinical, biological, and technical equivalence, and not a partial equivalence with various products. So we have to focus on the description of similarities and scientific evidence of the lack of negative impact on benefit-risk ratio, which is all described in the MDTG 2025. If you look at our PMCF activities, it is often noted that inadequately selected PMCF activities, for example, for the equivalence or for novelty, have gaps in clinical data, missing studies. For example, if I have a device that can be used for children and for adolescents, I have, of course, to put clinical data for all ages inside. Insufficient integration of safety and performance parameters in the PMCF activity, or the lack of quality. If you have good, bad user surveys or whatever. This is just to be complete, already talked about when Sean gave this question there. We have to do a clear breakdown of the literature search into the device under evaluation and the state of the art. And we have to justify this. And of course, not to mention normally, but we all have to submit all full texts that we are using in our evaluation. Clinical claims is a very, very crucial point, and the lack of clinical data to support these clinical claims. Often also, all clinical claims made in the promotion material, website, etc. should be supported by sufficient clinical evidence in the CEAR. Manufacturers very often forget what claims anybody has done on their website, in their promotional material or whatever. And if we see, or the notified body sees this afterwards, then we already have at least a little problem for this. Other points that are very, very easy to solve, but it always occur. Please look that we have consistency in all documents. Technical documentation according to the Annex 2 of the MDR, and if applicable, the summary thereof to be drawn up by the manufacturer shall be presented in a clear, organized, readily searchable, and unambiguous manner, and shall include in particular the elements listed in these annex. It should be submitted in a PDF format, and we need a clickable table of contents and bookmarks. And of course, all relevant documents, the CEP, CEAR, IFU, risk management, SLCP, or whatever, have to be submitted so that nothing is missing. So these have been the biggest pitfalls and the parts of the notified body there. And now we come to this part where we see what are the requirements of the different pathways. What pathways can we take to receive CE mark? So there is our normal first submission when we need clinical trials to get clinical data. We have legacy devices. We have wet devices, the so-called well-established devices. We have orphan medical devices. We have custom-made devices. We have devices that are falling under the article MDR 6110. And now we will look in detail what are these ones. So what is a well-established device according to the MDTG 2026? Medical Device Regulation 2017-745 does not provide a definition what a well-established technology is. The MDR only mentions devices similar to those listed in Article 61, paragraph 6b, what are namely sutures, staples, dental fillings, dental braces, tooth crowns, screws, wedges, plates, wires, pins, clips, and connectors. MDCG 2026 fills this gap and emphasizes that well-established technologies do not exclusively compromise the products mentioned above, but also similar devices. So our characteristics for wet devices, they have to be simple, common, and they have to have a consistent design with little further development. The generic product group is known to be safe and has not been associated with safety issues, well-known performance characteristics, the standard of care products with little further development, and they have to be on the market for a long time. So from view of the MDCG 2026, all products that meet these criteria can be considered well-established technologies. And we also define what are legacy devices. They are existing products that have been on the market already under the medical device directives under the MDD 9342 EEC or AMDD for IVDRs. A product of well-established technology can therefore also be a legacy device at the same time, but has not to need to. Of course, for legacy devices, there is a clinical evaluation necessary. MDCG 2026 clarifies that clinical evaluations based on sufficient clinical data are required for all devices, including devices identified in Article 61, paragraph 6b of the MDR. However, subset of devices does not necessarily require clinical investigations, even if the devices have not previously been CE marked and are also class 3 devices or implants. However, this only applies to the aforementioned subgroup and not to well-established technology devices in general. So I wanted to show you here a little bit in practical what are well-established devices. I took out here for cardiology and how has this been justified. But in order that we already have lost much time, I will go through this very short. And if you have interest, come back to me later. For example, well-established technologies in cardiology are ablation catheters using radio frequency, cryo-energy. These are diagnostic electrophysical catheters, leads for cardiac pacing, defibrillation, diagnostic therapeutic catheters for coronary and structural interventions, or diagnostic and therapeutic intracardiac devices for coronary and structural interventions. And the justification for us to be important that were accepted by the notified bodies is nearly always the same, so that this device has been on the market for more than 20 years, and that this is a device with no or only minor modification or without any safety issues through the last years. Just like I said, if you have interest in this, come back to me later, please. We'll now have a look at the Article 6110 at the performance-based approach, which is only for medical devices without direct clinical benefit, which have no clinical claims and which have where no clinical data is possible. Notified bodies do never accept the justification that clinical data is not available, just to notice. So what is the Article 6110 of the EU MDR? It provides a route for manufacturers to demonstrate that the medical device meets safety and performance standards without clinical data. While clinical evaluation is essential for proving compliance with the GSPRs, this article applies to devices for which clinical data is not deemed appropriate or necessary. This provision is especially relevant for low-risk devices or those that do not have direct clinical impact. So this option, therefore, is not available for class 3 or implantable devices. So it should be applied to lower risk devices where the performance can be sufficiently demonstrated through non-clinical data like mechanical testing, performance evaluations, or other bench testings. What are devices that normally can be eligible for this? Under Article 6110, certain types of medical devices are more likely to qualify for non-clinical data to demonstrate compliance. These include dental treatment units, mouth spatulators, operating lights, patient positioning systems, standalone software, blood glucose meters, or wheelchairs, and walking aids. These devices typically do not require direct clinical evaluation and may not provide clinical benefits, making clinical data unnecessary. Instead, performance and safety can be proven through non-clinical means. Manufacturers still must justify why clinical data is inappropriate, and just like I said, it is not accepted that no data is available. Justification must be documented in the clinical evaluation report. It must include the risk management with potential risks and hazards associated with the device under evaluation, effective mitigation of these risks, and the interaction with the human body. The devices that have limited or no direct interaction with the human body are more likely to qualify for 6110. Intended clinical performance, and the clinical data will still be necessary if clinical claims cannot be verified through non-clinical testing. When should Article 6110 be used? This pathway is most relevant for legacy devices that were previously CE marked under the MDD or AMDD, have a strong track record of safe and effective use. For well-established devices, they're based on major technologies that have documented safety and performance profiles. For low-risk devices, class 1 or 2A devices, where the risks of conducting new clinical investigations might not justify potential benefits. Higher risk devices, such as class 2B and 3, proving equivalence and meeting the required data standards can be more challenging. Manufacturers may need additional justifications or consider conducting clinical investigations if necessary. So, Article 6110 pathway is a valuable option for demonstrating conformity with safety and performance requirements when appropriate clinical data is not available. Particular advantages for legacy devices and well-established devices that need to comply with the MDR. Orphan devices, something that's also lying on my heart, because a lot of orphan devices will vanish from the European market. So the MDG 2024-10 is aimed at manufacturers of niche products as well as the responsible authorities and notified bodies. Because, of course, all submissions are costing money for the manufacturers, and in order not to lose all orphan devices on our market here, MDCG at least gave some solution approaches, would like to provide stakeholders with assistance in clinical evaluation. It points out permitted restrictions on clinical data that are collected prior to marketing. In particular, it considers extrapolations of data from other populations to be acceptable under circumstances. For example, if they can be balanced via post-market activities. Also draws attention to other data sources, such as equivalent products, registries, and also off-label use. We would like to support the approval process by providing notified bodies with assistance in the assessment. This is the so-called certificates with conditions, describing the roles of expert panels. However, it is still unclear how manufacturers will benefit from this. Custom-made devices are also mandatory for clinical evaluation under MDR 2017-45. They're unique, what makes it very hard to generate large-scale clinical data. Often literature reviews and PMS data are used instead, and extensive documentation can be resource-intensive for small manufacturers. Anyway, there's still another approach to gain clinical data via CMDs, as they can be used as equivalent device for CE marking, which is not the original thought of MDR, but what is legally possible. Anyway, the very good point now is, what is sufficient clinical data? It is not clearly defined in the MDR what is sufficient clinical data, how much data is sufficient. In order to demonstrate compliance with the relevant GSPRs, sufficient clinical data must be presented for all medical devices in the clinical evaluation. But what is it really? Scope and quality of clinical data deemed sufficient for a product should be determined by the manufacturer and has to be justified in the clinical evaluation. The risk class and the intended purpose of the device should be taken into account. And it is still unclear if the planned ISO 18699 standard for clinical evaluation will bring more clarity to this topic. So, according to the MDCG 2026 Appendix 3, we have different kinds of clinical data. I think this is very, very small here, so I put it at least up in two parts. Yeah. The rank 1 clinical evidence is high quality clinical trials across all variants, indications, patient populations. Rank 2, high quality clinical trials with some gaps. Rank 2, high quality clinical data collection systems, registries for studies with methodological weaknesses, but data must still be quantifiable. Rank 5 is equivalence data. Rank 6, data from similar products from state of the art. 7, complaints and vigilance data of our own product. 8, proactive PMS data, such as surveys. 9 is case reports, common specifications, non-clinical is rank 10. Simulated applications like animal cadaver tests, rank 11, and preclinical and bench tests compliance with standards is our rank 12. So just come back there. Rank 1 to 4 can be used for performance requirements and for safety requirements. And as we can see here, rank 5, our equivalence data can be used for both. Data from similar products from state of the art are supportive for both. Our own complaint and vigilance data can't be used for performance, but can be supportive for safety. Proactive PMS data like service can't be used at all. Case reports we can use as supportive for both. And rank 10, 11, 12 can prove clinical endpoints, but as this is no clinical data, this is not relevant to us. That's the big one. And no, sorry, I have to go back. We just look now again what kind of device we have. If you have legacy devices of class 3 and implantable, which are not VET, we have to take a combination of rank 1 to 4. Our well-established devices can be assessed through a combination of rank 5 to 12. We will look now for different combinations, what is enough for which type of device. We have data for VETs, and if we have only 10 to 12, and data from our similar products from state of the art, which can only be supportive, this is the question, could this be enough? And this could, of course, not be enough, as both data don't meet the requirements of clinical data which are specified in the MDR. And here I should check if 6110 is maybe eligible. If we combine data from 6 and 7, meaning similar products, supportive, and our own complaint and vigilance data, which we can't use for performance. It's still not enough. If we now can add case reports to this, our rank 9, this will be sufficient for low-risk devices, but not for high-risk, low-risk, yeah? What about products that are out of the scope of the MDCG, meaning class 1 to non-vet with low risks? So for them, still Appendix 3 of MDCG 2026 is mainly applicable, meaning we can use a combination of clinical data from 6 to 12, but not from 5 to 12, sorry, but not 6, meaning the similar products from the state of the art. Class 3, and implantable non-vet devices with high risks always have to get a combination of ranks 1 to 4. And the people here in this call, especially I always think, who are joining us from the United States, they have the big advantage if they already have FDA-cleared devices that they can also use real-world data, respective real-world evidence, if they are aiming for further on a CE approval. And as I just mentioned, while we started, I was thinking about having a very short look at the clinical evaluation of MDAI new guidance. But as the time ran out, I will skip this now and just show you, well, to give it to your heart, if you ever want to submit an application for a CE mark to a notified body here, please align your CER with the template MDCG 2020-13. This is the Clinical Evaluation Assessment Report, which is also used by the notified bodies to evaluate your report and your submission. If anybody is interested in this, have any questions or whatever, please contact me either via email or via LinkedIn. You can just use this QR code here, and I can, of course, assist you, can answer your questions, which are still open, and I can also give you these templates if anybody is interested here.